I am Claire, 33 years old, and I am a forensic accountant who spends her life unraveling massive corporate cover-ups, tracking down hidden millions, and bringing down criminals who thought they were completely above the law. I am trained to spot cold, calculated deception from miles away, but nothing in my professional life could have prepared me for the sickening trap my own husband and mother-in-law set for me in the name of high society status. Just days ago, I stood in a kitchen staring at a digital numbers reading 104 degrees Fahrenheit while my daughter whimpered in pain, completely unaware that the people who promised to love and protect us were about to sacrifice her safety for a corporate networking event. Before I continue this story and reveal the calculated move that brought an entire wealthy empire to its knees, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe right now if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family that underestimated your worth and played dangerous games with the people you care about most. The nightmare began exactly 48 hours ago, right in the middle of an upscale evening event. My 5-year-old daughter Lily had been feeling sluggish all afternoon, but my husband David insisted we drive out to his mother Beatrice's multi-million-dollar estate in the suburbs of Connecticut. Beatrice was hosting a lavish dinner party for 3 elite international investors, a networking night that David claimed would secure his position as the future CEO of the family real estate development firm. I didn't want to go, but David begged me, playing the role of the stressed husband who just needed his wife by his side for one critical night. I gave in, packed a small bag for Lily, and drove out to the estate, telling myself I could handle a few hours of Beatrice's passive-aggressive remarks if it meant supporting my marriage. But the moment we stepped through the front doors of that massive stone mansion, the atmosphere turned suffocating. The house was a monument to old money and carefully curated perfection, with crystal chandeliers casting a sharp glow over marble floors and walls lined with original artwork. It was a world built on appearances, where emotional coldness was masked by expensive perfume and polite smiles. I carried Lily upstairs to one of the guest bedrooms because her forehead felt warm, but Beatrice stopped me on the landing. She looked at Lily, then at me, her eyes narrowing with immediate judgment. She told me that children should be seen and not heard, especially when people of consequence were arriving. She then handed Lily a glass of red fruit punch, telling her to drink it and go to sleep immediately so she wouldn't disrupt the guests. I thanked her, took Lily to the room, and tucked her in, assuming she just needed to rest. 2 hours later, I slipped away from the cocktail hour to check on my daughter. The moment I walked into the guest room, panic seized my chest. Lily was shivering violently beneath the blankets, her skin flushed deep red and her lips dry. I pulled out my digital thermometer and pressed it to her forehead. The machine beeped, and the numbers flashed in the dim light, 104 degrees Fahrenheit. I lifted Lily into my arms, and her small body went completely rigid, her eyes rolling back slightly as a febrile seizure began to take hold. I didn't care about the party, the investors, or Beatrice's high society reputation. I wrapped Lily in a heavy coat, scooped her into my arms, and ran down the back staircase, desperate to get her to the nearest emergency room. I burst into the massive professional kitchen, heading straight for the mudroom exit where my car keys were hanging. But before I could reach the door, Beatrice stepped into my path, completely blocking the exit. She was holding a wine glass, her silk evening gown rustling as she glared at me with absolute disdain. She asked me where I thought I was going with that child. I told her Lily's fever was at 104 degrees, and she was having a seizure, and that I was taking her to the hospital right now. Beatrice didn't flinch. She set her wineglass down on the marble island, looked me straight in the eyes, and delivered a cold, calculated command. She told me that the hired Italian chef had just called in sick. The main course was supposed to be served in 30 minutes, and I needed to put Lily back upstairs and step in as the kitchen lead. She shouted that a little fever wouldn't kill the child, and commanded me to stop being dramatic and stop embarrassing this family in front of millionaire investors. I stared at her, completely disgusted by her lack of humanity. I told her she was insane if she thought I was going to cook a dinner while my daughter was convulsing in my arms. I tried to push past her using my shoulder to clear a path toward the door, but before I could take another step, David walked into the kitchen. He took one look at the confrontation, walked straight over to me, and jianged a sharp, heavy slap across my face. The force of the blow echoed in the quiet kitchen, sending a dull throb through my jaw and forcing me to stumble backward against the counter. David didn't look at Lily. He didn't check her temperature. He just pointed a finger in my face, his voice a harsh, angry whisper as he told me that I was ruining the biggest night of his career over a basic childhood cold. He righted that his mother was right, that I had always been too sensitive, and that if I walked out that door and ruined his family's reputation tonight, I would be completely cut off from the estate, the accounts, and everything we built. I stood there, the print of his hand burning on my cheek, clutching my shivering daughter tightly against my chest. I went completely dead silent. The last remaining ounce of love and loyalty I had for David vanished in that exact second. I didn't scream, I didn't argue, and I didn't shed a single tear. I just looked at my husband and his mother, recording every detail of their faces in my mind, knowing with absolute certainty that I was going to use my professional skills to systematically destroy their lives. My mind shifted gears, instantly snapping from the role of a wounded wife into the precise calculating machinery of a forensic accountant facing a hostile threat. In my profession, the first rule is to secure the ledger before fraudsters realize they are audited. Right now, that massive estate was an active crime scene, and I needed to act with absolute efficiency. There were no tears pooling in my eyes. There was no screaming or hysterical pleading. I simply adjusted my grip on my burning child, reached past David, and snatched my car keys off the marble counter. Before he could raise his hand, I turned on my heel and kicked the heavy oak kitchen door completely open. The freezing Connecticut air hit my face, but I did not stop. I sprinted down the stone steps into the thick snow, wrapping my heavy wool coat around Lily to shield her from the bitter wind. Her small chest heaved against mine, her breathing shallow and frantic, while her skin radiated an unnatural, terrifying heat. Every instinct screamed at me to run faster, to get her to safety, to put distance between us and that toxic mansion. My boots slipped on the icy driveway, but I kept my balance. My eyes locked on my reliable sedan parked at the far edge of the property. Behind me, the door banged open. David chased after me, his expensive dress shoes crunching loudly in the snow, ruining his tailored suit. He was not running to check on his daughter. He was running to protect his fragile ego. He shouted my name, his voice echoing across the manicured lawns, demanding that I turn around this instant. He yelled that I was overreacting, that I was acting like a hysterical fool, and that his investors were wondering where the kitchen staff was. I reached my car, wrenched the back door open, and carefully buckled Lily into her car seat, ignoring the steady stream of venom pouring from my husband's mouth. David reached the car just as I slammed the back door shut. He grabbed my arm, yanking me around to face him. His eyes were wild with a narcissistic fury I had never fully let myself see until tonight. He pointed his finger at my face and said if I drove away, I was never coming back. He threatened to lock me out, freeze every joint bank account, and make sure I walked away with absolutely nothing. He hissed that I was a nobody before I married into his prestigious family, and he would make sure I went back to being a nobody. I looked at the man I had spent 7 years loving, the man I had built a life with, and felt absolutely nothing but cold contempt. I yanked my arm away, got into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. I threw the car into reverse, ignoring his fists pounding against my window, and peeled out of the driveway. The roads were slick with black ice, but my hands were completely steady on the steering wheel. The heater blasted at full speed, yet my focus remained entirely on the sound of Lily's strained breathing from the back seat. My mind was racing, calculating variables, anticipating Beatrice and David's next moves. I knew exactly how these people operated. They were wealthy, arrogant, and accustomed to buying their way out of any consequence. The moment they realized I was actually going to the hospital, Beatrice would immediately try to cover her tracks. She would realize the kitchen security cameras had captured everything, the slap, her blocking the door, and whatever else had happened before I arrived. I reached for the Bluetooth system on my dashboard, and made a single crucial phone call. I did not call the police, not yet. I needed an ally who understood the digital infrastructure of that mansion better than anyone else. I called Andre. Andre was David's brother-in-law married to David's sister Penelope. He was a brilliant former private investigator turned cybersecurity expert. He was also an African-American man who had endured years of Beatrice's subtle racist microaggressions. Beatrice constantly belittled him, treating him as an unwelcome outsider who tarnished her perfect purebred family image. Andre and I had always shared a silent mutual respect, knowing we were both seen as the unworthy additions to this elite bloodline. The phone rang twice before Andre answered, his deep voice carrying over the speakers. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him I was driving Lily to the emergency room because her fever had spiked to 104 degrees and she was having a seizure. I kept my voice perfectly level as I told him David had just slapped me across the face because I refused to stay and cook for his mother's dinner party. Andre cursed loudly, the protective instinct immediately flaring up in his voice. I cut him off before he could ask questions. I told him he once mentioned that the high-end security cameras he installed at Beatrice's estate had a secret cloud backup system that even Beatrice did not know how to access. I instructed him to log into that system right now, lock down every single frame of video from the kitchen and the main hallways, and isolate the footage on a secure encrypted drive. I warned him that Beatrice and David were going to try to delete the local hard drives the second they realized I was not coming back. Andre never hesitated. He told me he was already booting up his terminal and that nobody would be able to touch those files without his direct authorization. He promised to secure the payload and told me to just focus on keeping my little girl alive. I ended the call, my foot pressing harder on the gas pedal as the glowing red sign of the emergency room finally came into view through the falling snow. I slammed the brakes, throwing the car into park the moment the tires hit the emergency zone. The automatic sliding doors were already opening as I bolted out of the driver's seat, ripped the back door open, and gathered my daughter into my arms. Lily was completely unresponsive now. Her body arched backward in another seizure, her jaw locked tight, a terrifying wheezing sound escaping her pale lips. I sprinted into the blinding fluorescent lights of the emergency room triage area, screaming for help. The response was immediate and overwhelming as I desperately called out her name. A triage nurse took one look at Lily's blue lips and slammed her hand on a red button. A shrill alarm echoed down the corridor, and within seconds, a team of medical professionals flooded through the double doors. Among them was Dr. Harrison, the head of pediatric emergency medicine, a tall man who immediately took charge of the chaotic scene. He gently but swiftly lifted Lily from my arms and placed her onto a rolling gurney. I tried to follow them, my hands reaching out to maintain contact with my little girl, but a nurse held me back. Dr. Harrison barked orders at his highly trained team, calling for a crash cart oxygen and an immediate intravenous line. He shouted that she was in severe respiratory distress and needed to be stabilized in the trauma bay right away. The heavy metal doors swung shut, cutting off my view of my daughter, and leaving me standing alone in the middle of the crowded emergency room. A numb sensation washed over me as a volunteer guided me to a plastic chair in the corner. The sterile smell of antiseptic and floor cleaner filled my lungs, contrasting sharply with the cold winter air still clinging to my wool coat. I sank into the hard plastic seat, my body trembling from the adrenaline crash. I caught my reflection in the dark glass of a nearby window. The stark lighting highlighted the angry red handprint blooming across my left cheek, a vivid reminder of the man I had married. Several other people in the waiting area cast nervous, pitying glances in my direction, likely assuming I was the victim of a typical domestic dispute. They had absolutely no idea I was a seasoned forensic accountant who had just declared war on a multimillionaire family. My phone began to vibrate violently in my pocket. I pulled it out to see a barrage of missed calls and unread messages. Every single one was from David. I pressed the phone to my ear and accessed my voicemail, expecting at least a shred of panic about his daughter. Instead, I heard the arrogant, furious voice of a man entirely consumed by his own damaged ego. David's first voicemail did not even mention Lily. He demanded to know why I had humiliated his mother by running out the back door. He yelled that his investors had asked where the hostess went, and he had been forced to invent a lie about a minor family emergency. The second voicemail was even more unhinged. He shouted that I had crossed a line I could never uncross, and that his mother was having a panic attack in the master suite because of my blatant disrespect. The third voicemail transitioned from anger to calculated financial threats. David hissed into the receiver, promising that if I did not return to the estate immediately and apologize to Beatrice, he would call his private banker and freeze every single joint account. He threatened to cut off my credit cards, cancel the auto pay on my car lease, and make sure I could not buy so much as a cup of coffee. He ended the message by explicitly stating that I was a replaceable asset and that he would bankrupt me before the sun came up. I lowered the phone, my jaw clenching so tightly my teeth ached. David thought he held all the power because his name was on the primary family trust. He thought he could use money to force me into submission, treating financial abuse as a leash to pull me back to his mother's kitchen. He fundamentally misunderstood the fiercely independent woman he had married. As an expert in uncovering corporate fraud, I spent my entire career tracking down hidden assets, offshore shell companies, and illicit money trails for federal agencies. David threatening to freeze my accounts was not a death sentence. It was a massive strategic error that told me exactly where his vulnerabilities lay. I tucked the phone back into my pocket, my mind systematically filing away his voicemails as leverage for the inevitable legal bloodbath. The waiting room clock ticked with an agonizing slowness, each second stretching into an eternity, while my daughter fought for her life behind those closed metal doors. I sat perfectly still, refusing to let the anxiety break my focus. I drafted a list of the financial servers I would need to breach the ledgers I needed to audit and the offshore accounts David casually mentioned during drunken dinners. I was completely ready to tear down their empire brick by brick from the inside out. Finally, after what felt like hours, the heavy doors to the trauma bay pushed open. Dr. Harrison walked out into the quiet waiting area. The commanding, urgent energy he had displayed earlier was completely gone. In its place was a heavy, chilling stillness. He walked slowly toward me, his shoulders rigid and his face drained of all color. He looked paler than the bright fluorescent lights overhead. He was gripping a metal clipboard so tightly his knuckles were white. He did not offer a reassuring smile. He did not tell me everything was going to be just fine. Dr. Harrison stopped right in front of my plastic chair, looked down at the medical chart on his clipboard, and then looked directly into my eyes with a grim expression that made my blood run absolutely cold. He took a slow, deep breath, clutching the clipboard that was about to change my entire reality. Dr. Harrison kept his voice remarkably low, glancing over his shoulder at the crowded triage area before returning his intense focus to me. He asked me to follow him away from the public waiting room, gesturing toward a heavy wooden door down a quiet, adjacent hallway. Every step I took felt like walking through wet cement, my body heavy with an exhaustion that was rapidly being overtaken by sheer terror. We entered a small, windowless family consultation room. It was the kind of sterile, softly lit space designed specifically by hospital administrators for delivering devastating news. The room had two uncomfortable fabric chairs and a box of tissues sitting squarely in the middle of a generic coffee table. Dr. Harrison closed the door firmly until it clicked shut, sealing us off from the chaotic noise of the emergency department. He did not sit down immediately. Instead, he leaned against the edge of the table, looking at me with a mixture of intense medical concern and an unmistakable underlying suspicion. I demanded to know what was wrong with my daughter, bracing myself to hear a diagnosis of meningitis, a severe brain infection, or some aggressive childhood leukemia. Dr. Harrison took a slow breath and stated that Lily was currently intubated and resting in the pediatric intensive care unit. He confirmed that his team had managed to halt the active seizures using intravenous medication, but her core temperature remained dangerously high and her breathing was entirely dependent on the ventilator. Then his tone shifted entirely, losing the comforting bedside manner and adopting the clinical sharp edge of an investigator. He told me that when they ran her initial blood panels to find the source of the fever, they ordered a comprehensive toxicology screen to rule out environmental factors. He looked directly at the handprint still glowing red on my cheek, then back to my eyes. He informed me that Lily did not have a viral or bacterial infection causing her fever and seizures. I stood frozen, trying to process his words. I asked him what he meant, my voice barely a whisper in the quiet room. Dr. Harrison tapped his pen against the clipboard and delivered the blow. He stated that Lily was experiencing acute liver toxicity and severe central nervous system distress due to a massive life-threatening overdose of diphenhydramine. I stared at him, my forensic brain struggling to translate the medical terminology into reality. I asked him if he meant the standard over-the-counter allergy medication. Dr. Harrison shook his head, correcting me immediately. He specified that the concentration in her bloodstream was not consistent with a child inadvertently swallowing a stray allergy pill or taking an extra dose of cherry-flavored liquid syrup. The lab results indicated a massive chemical concentration equivalent to 4 or 5 maximum-strength adult sleep aid tablets. He explained that a dose that massive aggressively attacks a small child's system, acting as a toxic poison that causes extreme tachycardia, hyperthermia, and ultimately the violent neurological seizures I had witnessed in the kitchen. I felt the room begin to spin around me. I frantically told him that I did not have adult sleep aids in my house, that I kept all medications locked away in a high cabinet, and that Lily had been perfectly fine just a few hours earlier before we left for the estate. Dr. Harrison watched my reaction closely, his eyes scanning my face for any sign of deception. He explained that pills of that specific adult dosage are incredibly bitter. A 5-year-old child would never willingly chew and swallow them on their own. The only way a dose that concentrated could enter her system so rapidly without her spitting it out was if the pills had been meticulously crushed into a fine powder and dissolved into a highly sweetened liquid to mask the harsh chemical taste. Someone had deliberately and methodically poisoned my daughter. The silence in the consultation room became absolutely suffocating. Dr. Harrison straightened his posture, crossing his arms over his chest. He informed me that as an attending physician, he is a mandated reporter under state law. Whenever a minor presents with non-accidental chemical toxicity of this magnitude, the hospital protocol is absolute and immediate. He told me he had already locked down Lily's room with hospital security and placed a direct call to the local police department. Furthermore, an investigator from Child Protective Services was currently en route to the hospital. He stated clearly that until the police and the agency concluded their initial interviews and cleared me of suspicion, I would not be allowed to be alone with my daughter. He advised me not to leave the hospital premises, warning that doing so would trigger an immediate arrest warrant. I did not argue with his protocol. I did not scream that I was a good mother or demand to see my child. My mind bypassed the panic and locked directly onto the timeline of the evening, shifting back into the cold analytical state that made me exceptional at my job. I traced every single minute backward. We arrived at the estate. We walked through the grand foyer. I carried Lily upstairs. Then the memory hit me with the force of a physical strike, freezing the blood in my veins. I saw the grand kitchen in my mind's eye. I saw the marble island, the crystal glasses lined up for the investors, and Beatrice standing near the refrigerator. I remembered the exact moment Beatrice had intercepted us on the landing before I could put Lily into the guest bed. I remembered the heavy crystal goblet in Beatrice's perfectly manicured hand. The liquid inside was a dark, opaque red, thick with sugary fruit punch. I recalled the exact chilling tone of my mother-in-law's voice, devoid of any grandmotherly warmth, masking her annoyance behind a tight, aristocratic smile. She had thrust the heavy glass into Lily's small hands. I heard Beatrice's exact words echoing in my head with perfect, horrifying clarity. She had looked down at my slightly fussy daughter and commanded, "Drink this and go to sleep so you do not bother my guests." The realization hit me so hard my knees buckled, and I had to grab the back of the fabric chair to stay standing. Beatrice had not handed Lily a simple glass of juice to calm her down. My mother-in-law, a woman obsessed with her flawless social image, had intentionally crushed a lethal dose of adult sedatives into a sugary drink just to ensure a 5-year-old child would not make any noise while her millionaire investors were in the dining room. She had poisoned her own granddaughter for the sake of a quiet networking dinner. And David, the man who had just slapped me for trying to save Lily's life, was about to do whatever it took to protect the monster who did it. I thanked Dr. Harrison, keeping my voice perfectly steady, despite the violent storm raging inside my chest. He left the consultation room, leaving me alone with the horrifying truth. Beatrice had poisoned Lily. David had protected Beatrice. I sat in that sterile room and forced my forensic brain to map out the battlefield. As an auditor who dismantled corrupt corporations, I understood power dynamics intimately. I was up against a family with generational wealth, deep political connections, and a team of ruthless defense attorneys on a massive retainer. They golfed with the local chief of police and funded the re-election campaigns for half the judges in the county. If I walked out there right now and screamed that my wealthy mother-in-law had intentionally drugged my daughter, the authorities would immediately write me off as a hysterical, grieving mother looking for a scapegoat. Beatrice would simply hire a premium crisis management firm. David would testify under oath that I was mentally unstable, and they would absolutely crush me. They would spin the narrative, bury the evidence, and walk away completely untouched. I needed airtight, undeniable proof. I absolutely needed the digital paper trail before making an accusation. The heavy wooden door opened, breaking my intense train of thought. A uniformed police officer and a stern-looking woman with a badge from Child Protective Services walked in. They introduced themselves and immediately launched into their interrogation. Their tone was highly accusatory, probing for any sign of guilt or negligence on my part. The officer asked if I had a history of severe depression or anxiety disorders. The caseworker asked if there was recent tension in my marriage causing me to act irrationally and harm my own flesh and blood. I knew exactly how to handle this trap. I drew upon every single ounce of willpower I possessed to suppress the burning rage threatening to consume me. I made the agonizing, calculated decision to play dumb. I let the tears fall freely, adopting the persona of a completely baffled, terrified mother facing an inexplicable tragedy. I told them I had absolutely no idea how Lily could have ingested a massive dose of adult sedatives. I explained carefully that I keep all medications in a locked security box at our house, far out of reach of a child. I detailed our evening timeline, emphasizing that we had been at my mother-in-law's estate for a formal dinner party and that I had brought Lily straight to the hospital when she collapsed. I played the role perfectly, answering their aggressive questions with frantic confusion, never once directly pointing the finger at Beatrice. I knew that if I tipped my hand too early, the police might go to the estate and inadvertently give Beatrice the chance to control the narrative before Andre secured the video files. I had to let the authorities think this was an unsolved medical mystery for just a little longer. The caseworker took meticulous notes, eventually stating that while the investigation was ongoing, my cooperation was appreciated. They instructed me to remain at the hospital and finally granted me permission to see my daughter under strict medical supervision. As I walked down the brightly lit corridor toward the pediatric intensive care unit, my mind raced ahead to anticipate David and Beatrice's next strategic maneuvers. I knew exactly what they were doing at that very moment back at their lavish mansion. They were likely huddling with their expensive corporate lawyers in the private study, crafting a flawless, legally sound story to pin this entire nightmare on me. Beatrice would use her high society influence to paint me as an unfit, overwhelmed working mother who accidentally or intentionally harmed her own child to ruin an important networking party. David would play the tragic, long-suffering husband, feigning heartbreak for the cameras, while throwing me under the bus to protect the precious family fortune. They expected me to panic and make a crucial mistake. They expected me to act like a weak, defenseless victim who lacked the resources to fight back. I decided right then that I would give them exactly what they wanted until the exact moment I dropped the heavy, unforgiving guillotine on their perfect, privileged lives. I stepped into Lily's room and my heart shattered all over again. The rhythmic mechanical hiss of the life support ventilator filled the freezing cold air. My beautiful, innocent 5-year-old girl looked incredibly small in the center of the large hospital bed, surrounded by glowing monitors tracking her fragile vital signs. A terrifying web of plastic tubes and wires covered her pale skin, forcing oxygen into her struggling lungs. I walked slowly to her bedside and gently took her tiny, limp hand in mine, being extremely careful not to disturb the intravenous lines pumping vital fluids into her veins. I slowly pulled my cell phone from my heavy wool coat pocket and opened a highly secure encrypted messaging application. I typed a quick coded text to Andre, asking if the digital package was secured. The seconds stretched agonizingly as I watched the typing indicator bubble appear on the screen. Finally, Andre's response came through bright and clear. He confirmed that the cloud footage from the kitchen was successfully isolated, fully encrypted, and completely locked away from the estate's local network. Beatrice and David could not touch it no matter how much money they threw at their IT department. I slid the phone back into my pocket with a steady hand. I looked down at my sleeping, intubated daughter, softly brushing a stray lock of brown hair from her feverish forehead. Standing there in the cold, sterile light of the intensive care unit, looking at the damage they had inflicted on my innocent child, I made a silent, unbreakable vow. I would absolutely not just take Lily and walk away quietly into the long night. I would use every single resource I possessed to methodically, ruthlessly, and permanently obliterate my husband's incredibly corrupt family. Morning arrived with a cruel, blinding brightness that cut through the sterile blinds of the pediatric intensive care unit. I had not slept a single second. I sat rigidly in the stiff hospital chair beside Lily, tracking every mechanical breath pushed into her tiny lungs by the ventilator. The digital clock on the wall flipped to 8 in the morning. Exactly on cue, the heavy double doors of the intensive care ward swung open. The sound of expensive leather shoes echoing against the linoleum floor announced their arrival. I stood up and walked to the glass partition of my daughter's room. David and Beatrice marched down the hallway. They looked entirely unbothered by the fact that they had spent the night sleeping in their luxury estate while my child fought for her life. Beatrice wore a perfectly tailored charcoal pantsuit, her hair immaculately styled. David walked beside her in a crisp, dark navy suit, projecting the absolute authority of a future chief executive officer. Flanking them was a tall, sharp-featured man, clutching a thick leather briefcase. I immediately recognized him from the society pages. He was Elias Vance, a notoriously ruthless defense attorney who specialized in making the criminal charges of the ultra-wealthy disappear into thin air. They had brought a shark to a hospital ward. Beatrice's sharp eyes scanned the hallway and immediately locked onto the uniformed police officer and the Child Protective Services caseworker standing near the central nurses' station. In a fraction of a second, I witnessed a horrifying Academy Award-winning transformation. The cold, aristocratic monster who had commanded me to cook while my daughter convulsed completely vanished. Beatrice's shoulders slumped forward. Her hands began to tremble violently. She pulled a pristine white silk handkerchief from her designer handbag and pressed it against her eyes, producing a sudden, spectacular flood of tears. She practically stumbled toward the authorities, forcing David to catch her by the arm to steady her. I pushed the heavy glass door of the room open just enough to hear the performance unfold. Beatrice threw herself upon the mercy of the caseworker, clutching the woman's hands in a display of unbearable grandmotherly grief. She sobbed loudly, asking if her precious angel was going to survive. The caseworker, clearly taken aback by this raw display of high society emotion, gently tried to ask about the timeline of the previous evening. Beatrice did not hesitate. She launched a meticulously crafted, devastating smear campaign designed to completely obliterate my credibility before I could utter a single accusation. Beatrice wept into her handkerchief and told the caseworker that she had been terrified to speak up until now. She claimed that I had been suffering from a severe, undiagnosed psychological break for months. Beatrice wove a brilliant lie stating that my demanding career as an accountant had driven me into a deep, dark depression, making me incredibly unstable and deeply resentful of her family's success. She lowered her voice to a dramatic, terrified whisper, ensuring the police officer heard every single word. She stated definitively that I must have overdosed the child for attention. Beatrice claimed I was insanely jealous of David's networking dinner and that I crushed those adult sedatives into the cup simply to force my husband to abandon his career obligations and focus entirely on me. The audacity of the lie was paralyzing. She was taking her exact crime and perfectly superimposing it onto my psychological profile. I stepped out of the hospital room, my voice steady as I told Beatrice to stop lying. The police officer immediately stepped between us, placing a firm hand on his utility belt. The caseworker turned her piercing gaze toward David. She asked him directly if there was any truth to his mother's harrowing claims about my mental instability. David looked at me. His eyes were completely dead void of any warmth or shared history we had built over 7 years of marriage. He shifted his gaze back to the caseworker and put on a masterful display of a broken, grieving husband. He nodded slowly, his voice cracking with manufactured sorrow. David told the authorities that I had been acting erratically for the better part of a year. He blatantly lied, claiming I frequently locked myself in the bathroom, muttered about destroying his family, and exhibited terrifying mood swings. He then did something so exceptionally cruel it nearly knocked the breath out of my lungs. He pointed to the red, bruised handprint still visible on my left cheek. David told the police officer that I had become completely unhinged in the kitchen last night, screaming that I wanted to hurt myself and the baby. He claimed he was forced to slap me across the face purely in self-defense to snap me out of a violent, hysterical, psychotic break before I could do further damage. Elias Vance, the defense attorney, stepped forward smoothly. He handed a stack of hastily typed legal documents to the caseworker. He stated that his clients were fully cooperating with the investigation and that they had grave immediate concerns for the safety of the minor child if left in my custody. He demanded that the hospital enact emergency protective protocols. The caseworker read the documents, her face hardening into a mask of bureaucratic authority. She walked over to me, her eyes sweeping over my disheveled clothes and bruised face, clearly seeing the exact unstable, battered woman David had just described. She held up a preliminary safety order. Her words were sharp, clinical, and completely devastating. She informed me that based on multiple corroborating testimonies and the severity of the chemical poisoning, I was immediately deemed a potential flight and safety risk. She stated that until the police investigation was fully complete and I underwent a mandatory psychiatric evaluation, I could not be left alone with Lily. I stared at the paperwork in her hand. The sheer injustice of this orchestrated nightmare burned through my veins. They truly believed they had won the war. I looked at the caseworker, acknowledging her devastating directive with a slow, compliant nod. I did not fight or scream. I simply turned my back on David and Beatrice, refusing to give them the satisfaction of witnessing my agony. I walked over to the glass partition, placing my hand flat against the cold surface, keeping my eyes locked on Lily's fragile sleeping form for one long, agonizing second. A hospital security guard stepped forward politely but firmly, instructing me that I needed to vacate the immediate vicinity of the intensive care unit. I complied without a single word of protest, projecting the exact image of a defeated, broken woman that my husband expected to see. I turned and walked down the long, brightly lit corridor, my footsteps echoing against the linoleum. Every single muscle in my body demanded that I turn around, shatter the glass, and physically tear my daughter away from those machines, but my professional discipline anchored me. The moment the heavy double doors swung shut behind me, completely severing me from the ward, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a single encrypted text message from Andre. It contained only a floor number and a parking space designation. I bypassed the main elevators, knowing David or his high-powered attorney might have someone watching my movements. Instead, I took the concrete stairwell descending floor after floor into the freezing subterranean depths of the hospital parking garage. The lowest level of the garage was desolate and entirely submerged in shadows. The flickering fluorescent tubes overhead cast long, eerie reflections across the damp concrete. The smell of exhaust fumes and stagnant water hung heavy in the freezing winter air. I moved quietly between the rows of parked cars, my senses heightened, scanning the dim perimeter for any sign of a trap. I knew that in high-stakes corporate warfare surveillance was standard procedure, and David had the capital to deploy private investigators at a moment's notice. Near the farthest concrete pillar, a pair of headlights flashed twice in quick succession. I hurried toward the sleek, dark SUV idling quietly in the corner. The passenger side door unlocked with a sharp click. I pulled it open and slid into the heavily tinted interior, shutting the cold out behind me. Andre sat in the driver's seat, his hands gripping the steering wheel. He wore a dark jacket, his expression completely unreadable in the dim dashboard lighting. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. We just sat in the heavy silence, two outsiders who had finally collided with the ugly, toxic core of a billionaire family. I looked at him, noticing the tight clench of his jaw. I asked him directly if he had managed to secure the digital package before they noticed the backdoor breach. Andre let out a harsh, bitter exhale, shaking his head as he leaned back against the leather seat. He told me that David and Beatrice had not just noticed something was wrong, they had initiated a complete scorched earth protocol. Andre explained that less than an hour after I fled the estate with Lily, Beatrice had placed a frantic, highly classified call to the elite private security firm that managed the mansion. He tapped a few keys on a tablet resting on the center console, bringing up a secure log of network activity. He pointed to a series of red timestamps cascading down the screen. Andre detailed how David had personally authorized an immediate total wipe of the entire local server network. David told the security company that a massive system glitch had corrupted their local drives, demanding a complete factory reset under the guise of an emergency protocol. Because Beatrice paid the firm an exorbitant monthly retainer of over $50,000 to maintain her illusion of absolute security, the technicians did not ask a single critical question or require a standard police report before destroying potential evidence. They simply executed the command, wiping every single frame of video, every security log, and every access timestamp from the local servers within minutes. Andre looked at me, his dark eyes fierce with a cold, protective anger. He said they thought they had completely erased the kitchen footage. They thought they had buried the truth under a mountain of cash and corporate influence. I felt a brief, terrifying spike of panic grip my chest, but then I saw the sharp, unmistakable glint of absolute triumph in Andre's eyes. He reached into the inner pocket of his heavy jacket and pulled out a small, heavy rectangular object. It was a military-grade, fully encrypted solid-state hard drive. He held it out to me, the metal casing catching the faint glow of the dashboard display. Andre's voice dropped an octave, resonating with years of suppressed frustration. He reminded me that Beatrice had always treated him like hired help, constantly undermining his intelligence with her racist, condescending remarks. Because she viewed him as completely inferior due to his racial background, she arrogantly dismissed his capabilities and never bothered to understand the massive depth of his actual expertise in elite cybersecurity. When he installed that smart home system 3 years ago, he knew exactly what kind of ruthless, manipulative people he was dealing with. He had secretly established a hidden, heavily encrypted backdoor protocol that continuously mirrored every single byte of data to a private offshore cloud server, utilizing a randomized proxy network that completely bypassed the main firewall. Long before David ordered the local wipe, Andre had already intercepted the raw, uncut 4K resolution footage from the kitchen cameras. He placed the heavy drive directly into my palm, his fingers closing firmly over mine. He told me that the drive contained the exact moment Beatrice crushed the pills and handed the glass to Lily with crystal-clear audio. We finally had the undeniable video evidence, and I was going to use it to systematically and ruthlessly burn their entire elite corporate empire straight to the ground. I slipped the heavy metal drive into my coat pocket, the cold edge pressing against my hip like a loaded weapon. I thanked Andre, promising him that his part in this would remain entirely untraceable. He gave me a single grim nod before shifting his SUV into gear and melting back into the shadows of the subterranean garage. I walked out into the biting winter wind, my breath forming harsh white clouds in the freezing air. I crossed the busy avenue directly opposite the hospital and walked into the lobby of a rundown neon-lit motel. It was the kind of cheap, transient place where the front desk clerk did not ask questions and cash was always accepted. I rented a room on the second floor, a dingy space that smelled faintly of stale smoke and harsh industrial cleaner. The contrast between the stained carpet and the pristine marble floors of Beatrice's estate could not have been starker, but I did not care. This room offered exactly what I needed: absolute privacy and an unsecured internet connection. I locked the deadbolt, pulled the flimsy curtains shut against the glaring streetlights, and sat down at the chipped veneer desk. I opened my laptop, the screen illuminating the dark room. David and his mother had always viewed my career with barely concealed contempt. To them, I was just a mid-level desk worker, a boring number cruncher who played with spreadsheets to earn a modest middle-class salary. They possessed the staggering arrogance of inherited wealth, believing that their status automatically made them the smartest people in any room. They completely failed to understand what a forensic accountant actually does. I do not just balance budgets. I dissect financial ecosystems, trace hidden money through labyrinthine networks, and build airtight federal cases against white-collar criminals who think their wealth makes them untouchable. David's family real estate firm, Vanguard Heritage Development, was a multi-million-dollar empire built on decades of high society networking. 5 years ago, long before the cracks in my marriage became visible, David had asked me to help streamline their tax compliance software. He wanted to save money on external consultants and assumed his wife would happily do the grunt work for free. I had set up their entire back-end financial tracking system. Because David was notoriously lazy with cybersecurity and arrogant enough to believe nobody would ever dare audit his family, he never bothered to revoke my master administrative access. He simply assumed I was too docile and obedient to ever look where I was not supposed to. That assumption was about to cost him his entire life. I typed a string of commands into my terminal, bringing up the secure login portal for Vanguard Heritage Development. My fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing the superficial firewall they had installed last year. I input my old credentials, holding my breath for a fraction of a second. The screen flashed green. Access granted. I was inside the heart of their financial empire. I started with the current fiscal year, downloading massive data dumps of their general ledger accounts, payable and contractor invoices. At first glance, the books looked perfectly balanced, a pristine facade designed to keep local tax authorities happy. But I was not a local auditor doing a routine check. I deployed specialized tracking software I used for corporate fraud investigations, running algorithms designed to flag irregular payment patterns and duplicate vendor identifiers. Within 20 minutes, the first anomaly triggered a red alert on my screen. I opened a file related to a massive luxury condo development project they had recently completed downtown. The reported costs were staggering, far exceeding the industry standard for the materials listed. I began peeling back the layers of the transaction history. The conflict shifted from a sickening feeling of personal betrayal to the cold, hard thrill of an active investigation. I traced a series of monthly payments categorized as high-end architectural consulting fees. The money was being funneled to a third-party vendor registered under a generic LLC. I ran a cross-reference check on the vendor's registration address. It did not point to a prestigious architectural firm. It pointed to a vacant strip mall in Nevada. I kept digging, my eyes scanning line after line of financial data. The deeper I went, the more the absolute rot of their empire exposed itself. They were creating phantom contractors, generating fake invoices for services that were never rendered, and paying those invoices with funds pulled directly from their investors' capital pools. I tracked the flow of the phantom payments, watching the money bounce through a series of domestic shell companies before disappearing into the ether. But money never truly disappears. It leaves a digital footprint, a shadow, that a trained forensic accountant can illuminate. I isolated the routing numbers from the final domestic transfers and ran a global registry check. My heart hammered against my ribs as the search results populated on my screen. The funds were being wired into a series of offshore accounts located in the Cayman Islands. These accounts were shielded by intense banking secrecy laws, but the routing protocols tied them directly back to a master trust. I accessed the foundational documents of that master trust hidden deep within the restricted executive files on David's server. The primary beneficiary of that offshore trust was Beatrice. David was listed as the sole secondary signatory. They were not just padding their expense accounts or dodging a few $1,000s in corporate taxes. This was massive systemic financial fraud. They were actively embezzling millions of dollars from their own real estate investors to fund Beatrice's lavish country club lifestyle and David's desperate need to project power. I sat back in the cheap plastic chair, the neon light from the motel sign outside washing over my face. The sheer scale of their criminality was staggering. This was no longer just a bitter domestic dispute over child custody. This was no longer just a mother fighting to protect her poisoned daughter from a ruthless mother-in-law. The battlefield had completely shifted. I was now holding the blueprints to a massive federal crime. I had the power to trigger an investigation that would completely dismantle their corporation, seize their assets, and send both my husband and his mother to federal prison for decades. I stared at the blinking cursor on my screen, downloading every single encrypted file to my secure drive, ready to initiate total destruction. The download completed with a sharp chime that echoed in the silent motel room. I immediately disconnected from the motel's unsecured network and engaged a heavily encrypted offline local server I had built for exactly this kind of deep forensic dive. I rubbed my exhausted eyes and glanced at the digital clock glowing on the nightstand. It was just past midnight. My 18-hour marathon was officially underway. I opened the first batch of general ledgers from Vanguard Heritage Development. As a forensic accountant, I knew that criminals always leave a pattern. They get arrogant, they get greedy, and they get sloppy. David and Beatrice were incredibly sloppy. They treated the company's operating accounts like their own personal piggy bank, completely ignoring the basic principles of fiduciary duty. For the first 4 hours, I mapped out the initial layer of their deceit. I cross-referenced their reported operational expenses against their actual cash flow. It was like peeling back the wallpaper of a rotting house. I found dozens of recurring payments categorized as property maintenance and structural consulting. I ran those vendor identification numbers through federal business registries. None of them were real companies. They were ghost entities registered to empty post office boxes in Delaware and Wyoming. The money was being funneled out of Vanguard Heritage Development in increments of $50,000, carefully structured to avoid triggering automatic IRS reporting thresholds. By dawn, my back ached and my eyes burned from staring at the glowing screen, but the adrenaline surging through my veins kept me laser-focused. I brewed a cup of terrible instant coffee using the motel room machine and sat right back down at the desk. I needed to see exactly where the ghost payments were landing. I deployed a specialized tracing algorithm I had developed for federal investigations. It took the software less than an hour to break through the obfuscation layers. The domestic shell companies were nothing more than a funnel. The real destination was a sophisticated network of offshore accounts registered in the Cayman Islands. I pulled up the foundational banking documents for the Cayman accounts. My heart hammered a steady rhythm against my ribs as I read the signatory pages. Beatrice was listed as the primary beneficiary of a massive offshore trust with David, acting as the sole authorized executor. They were not merely skimming profits. They were actively embezzling millions of dollars straight out of the pockets of their own private investors. I pulled up the investor prospectus for their flagship project, a supposedly luxury residential high-rise downtown. The project had been delayed for 3 years, bleeding capital. David had constantly blamed supply chain issues and zoning disputes. The ledgers told the real, unvarnished story. The luxury high-rise was a colossal failure plagued by severe structural defects and massive cost overruns. Instead of declaring bankruptcy or taking a legitimate loss, David and Beatrice had decided to rob Peter to pay Paul. They were soliciting millions in new capital from elite investors promising massive returns on future developments. Instead of using those funds to actually build anything, they routed the money directly through the Cayman Islands Trust. It was a classic textbook Ponzi scheme wrapped in high society real estate branding. I spent the next 6 hours tracking exactly how Beatrice spent those embezzled funds. The sheer audacity of her lifestyle made my stomach churn. While she was screaming at me for ruining a dinner party and forcing me to cook for her guests, she was funding her entire aristocratic existence with stolen money. I found wire transfers paying for her exclusive country club memberships, her chartered private jets to Europe, her custom-tailored wardrobe, and her high society charity galas. She was playing the role of a billionaire philanthropist, using money she had stolen from hardworking investors. She built her throne on a mountain of fraud. David was just as guilty. I found his digital signature authorizing the transfer of $3 million to cover massive gambling debts and luxury car leases. He was stealing from his own company to maintain the illusion of success. The man who had slapped me, the man who had threatened to freeze my bank accounts and leave me destitute, was secretly drowning in a sea of corporate fraud. He thought his name and his family legacy made him invincible. He had absolutely no idea that his quiet, unassuming wife was currently dismantling his entire world line by single line. As the afternoon sun began to bleed through the cheap motel curtains, my 18-hour audit finally came to an end. My fingers cramped as I organized the staggering mountain of evidence into a clean, impenetrable sequence. I created detailed flowcharts mapping the movement of every single stolen dollar from the Vanguard Heritage Development accounts to the Cayman Islands Trust, and finally to Beatrice's personal expenses. I attached the forged vendor invoices, the falsified tax returns, and the specific digital signatures linking David directly to the federal wire fraud. I left absolutely no room for any defense attorney to maneuver. I compiled every single document, spreadsheet, and flowchart into a massive, highly organized digital file. When I finally clicked Save, the document rendered into a flawless, undeniable 300-page dossier. It was a masterpiece of forensic accounting. It was not just a collection of suspicious transactions. It was a complete, irrefutable roadmap for a massive federal indictment. Any competent prosecutor at the Internal Revenue Service or the Federal Bureau of Investigation could pick up this single dossier and secure a conviction within a matter of weeks. The evidence was absolute. I backed up the comprehensive dossier to my encrypted drive alongside the horrifying security video Andre had extracted from the estate. I stared at the two files sitting side by side on my computer desktop. One file contained the visual proof of Beatrice attempting to murder my 5-year-old daughter. The other file contained the financial proof of a $14 million embezzlement scheme. Together, they represented the absolute annihilation of my husband and his mother. I closed my laptop, the sudden silence of the motel room washing over me. My entire body trembled with a heavy mixture of profound exhaustion and absolute exhilarating power. David and Beatrice had spent years treating me like a disposable asset, a lower-class intruder who should be grateful just to stand in their shadow. They had severely underestimated my intelligence, my resilience, and my fierce capacity for retribution. I picked up the encrypted hard drive, feeling the heavy metallic weight of it in my palm. I was no longer a victim trapped in a toxic marriage. I was the chief architect of their total destruction. I now held the exact detonator to their entire financial empire, and I was completely ready to blow it to pieces. My grip on the encrypted hard drive tightened as a sharp metallic chime echoed from my laptop. The notification banner flashed across the upper right corner of my screen, momentarily cutting through the heavy silence of the cheap motel room. The sender name displayed clearly in bold letters. It was Charles Montgomery, the ruthless defense attorney. David and Beatrice had paraded through the hospital corridors just 24 hours ago. I set the hard drive down on the chipped veneer desk, carefully aligning it next to my computer mouse. I took a deep, steadying breath, preparing myself for whatever legal maneuvering they had concocted, and clicked open the email. The subject line was sterile and entirely devoid of any personal connection. It read, "Dissolution of marriage and custody surrender agreement." There were no pleasantries in the body of the email. Charles Montgomery did not bother with the standard professional greetings. He simply attached a massive 70-page portable document format file and offered a brief, chilling cover letter outlining my husband's absolute demands. I scrolled down to read the summary, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon with the practiced efficiency of a forensic auditor who spent her entire career dissecting contracts. David was demanding a complete and total capitulation. The divorce settlement explicitly stated that I would forfeit any and all claims to the marital assets. I would surrender my equity in the house we had purchased together, a house I had largely funded with my own salary, while David funneled his income into his mother's fraudulent real estate ventures. The agreement demanded I walk away with zero alimony, zero spousal support, and zero access to any of the investment portfolios we had built over 7 years of marriage. They wanted to strip me down to nothing, leaving me financially destitute and entirely dependent on the charity of strangers. But the financial devastation was merely the prelude to the true nightmare contained within those 70 pages. I scrolled to the section regarding child custody, and my blood ran absolutely cold. The words on the screen blurred for a fraction of a second before my sheer rage forced them back into sharp focus. David was demanding full, irrevocable legal and physical custody of Lily. The document stipulated that I would be stripped of all parental rights, effectively erasing me from my daughter's life forever. I would be granted no visitation, no supervised contact, and no legal standing to make any medical or educational decisions on her behalf. Beatrice and David intended to take my 5-year-old child and raise her inside their toxic, corrupt empire, completely isolating her from the mother who had just risked everything to save her life. The cover letter from Charles Montgomery contained the final, brutal ultimatum. He spelled it out with horrifying clarity, ensuring I understood exactly how tightly they believed they had the noose wrapped around my neck. Montgomery stated that Beatrice had fully briefed the local police department on my supposed history of severe psychological instability. He reminded me that the authorities were currently investigating the massive overdose of adult sedatives found in Lily's bloodstream. Then came the extortion. Montgomery wrote that if I signed the settlement and custody surrender agreement within 48 hours, David would graciously use his familial influence to convince Beatrice not to press formal charges of attempted murder and child endangerment against me. They were offering me a sadistic trade. I could sign away my daughter and my entire life's work, or I could face a fabricated criminal trial designed to lock me in a federal penitentiary for the next 20 years. David actually thought this would work. He genuinely believed that the threat of a fabricated prison sentence would shatter my resolve and force me to crawl back into the shadows. He assumed that I was nothing more than a terrified middle-class accountant facing the terrifying wrath of a billionaire dynasty. He expected me to weep, to panic, and to blindly sign the documents just to preserve my own freedom. He expected me to sacrifice Lily to save myself. The sheer audacity of the demand did not break me. It did not send me into a spiral of hysterical fear or despair. Instead, it hardened my resolve into something resembling solid titanium. I read the email a second time, analyzing every single threat, every single arrogant assumption woven into the legal text. They were so incredibly confident in their own invincibility. They were so utterly convinced that their money and their high society connections made them untouchable. They had built a perfect insulated reality where they could poison a child, frame an innocent mother, and steal $14 million without ever facing a single consequence. I realized in that moment that simply handing my evidence over to the authorities was no longer enough. Sending a digital file to the police and watching them get arrested quietly from the comfort of this motel room would not satisfy the burning demand for justice roaring in my chest. I needed to see their faces. I needed to witness the exact second their arrogant illusions shattered into a million irreparable pieces. I needed them to feel the precise suffocating terror they had tried to inflict upon me. I closed the email and opened a blank document, my mind rapidly formulating the perfect trap. I needed to get David, Beatrice, and their smug attorney into one single room. I needed to create an environment where they felt absolutely victorious, a setting where they believed I was finally submitting to their demands. If I played the role of the defeated, broken wife, they would eagerly gather to watch me surrender. They would want an audience for their triumph. I would give them their audience. I would give them their meeting. I would carefully orchestrate a formal legal gathering where they could gloat over my supposed destruction. And then, when they were completely disarmed by their own arrogance, I would detonate the explosive evidence I held in my hand. I began typing my response to Charles Montgomery, crafting every single word to ensure they walked willingly and blindly straight into their own spectacular annihilation. I stared at the blinking cursor on my laptop screen before deciding that an email to Charles Montgomery was too formal for the opening move of my trap. An email allowed them time to consult, to strategize, and to maintain a professional distance. I needed to bypass the attorney and appeal directly to the most vulnerable, easily manipulated aspect of their entire operation. I needed to target David's bloated, fragile ego. I picked up my phone and opened my text thread with my husband. The last message he had sent me was a vicious threat demanding I return to the estate. I took a steadying breath and began to type carefully, discarding my actual vocabulary to adopt the tone of a terrified, cornered animal. I typed that I had received the legal documents from his lawyer and that I was completely overwhelmed. I added intentional typos and erratic punctuation to simulate shaking hands. I wrote that I could not fight his family, that the police investigation was terrifying me, and that I just wanted all of this to end. I explicitly stated that I was ready to give up and sign the custody surrender papers, begging him to promise that Beatrice would drop the criminal accusations so I would not go to jail. I stared at the pathetic, groveling message for exactly 3 seconds before pressing send. The digital swoosh sounded incredibly loud in the quiet motel room. I knew David. I knew how his mind worked. He would not be able to resist the absolute high of seeing me beg. He would want to savor his victory personally, rather than letting his lawyer handle the surrender. Less than 2 minutes later, my phone vibrated violently against the cheap veneer desk. The caller identification displayed David's name. I cleared my throat, forcing my vocal cords to tighten, and answered the call on the third ring. I did not say hello. I simply let out a shuddering, shaky breath directly into the receiver. David did not bother with pleasantries either. He immediately demanded to know if I was finally ready to stop acting like a lunatic and accept reality. I forced my voice to tremble, pitching it a full octave higher than my normal speaking register. I told him I was so scared. I stammered through a rehearsed apology, crying real tears that I pulled from the lingering trauma of seeing Lily in the intensive care unit. I told David that I knew I could never beat his mother's influence and that I did not want to spend the rest of my life in a federal prison. I begged him to arrange a formal deposition meeting with his lawyer so we could finalize the paperwork immediately. I pleaded with him to make the nightmare stop, promising I would sign away all my parental rights and all my financial claims if he just protected me from the police. I played the role of the shattered, desperate woman so flawlessly that it actually made my own stomach turn. I listened to the heavy silence on the other end of the line, waiting for his monstrous arrogance to take the bait. When David finally spoke, his voice dripped with a sickening, toxic satisfaction. He let out a low, cruel laugh that resonated through the phone speaker. He told me that I should have realized my place years ago, instead of trying to pretend I belonged in his world. He mocked my middle-class upbringing, sneering that a glorified spreadsheet jockey could never outmaneuver the Vanguard heritage legacy. David basked in his perceived supremacy, lecturing me about how his mother had always known I was a weak, unstable gold digger who would eventually crack under pressure. He explicitly stated that this was what happened when ordinary people tried to cross billionaires. He promised me that as long as I sat down, kept my mouth shut, and signed the documents without a single complaint, he would graciously tell the authorities that my alleged psychotic break was a temporary episode. He would let me walk away a free, albeit completely destitute woman. David then dictated the terms of my surrender. He ordered me to arrive at Charles Montgomery's high-rise downtown legal office at exactly 10 o'clock the following morning. He stressed that a court reporter and a child protective services representative would be present to officially witness the transfer of custody, ensuring I could never attempt to revoke my consent. He told me to dress appropriately and not to embarrass him one last time. I kept my voice meek and compliant, whispering a final pathetic thank you before he abruptly ended the call. The dial tone hummed in my ear for a few seconds. I slowly lowered the phone to the desk. The moment the screen went black, every trace of the terrified broken wife vanished from my face. My features settled into a cold, completely void expression. My heart rate slowed to a steady rhythmic beat. I had successfully cornered the predators. They had enthusiastically scheduled their own public execution and invited all the necessary legal witnesses to watch it happen. I pushed the plastic motel chair back and walked over to my small overnight bag. I had not packed much when I fled the estate, but I had grabbed the one outfit I kept perfectly pressed for federal court appearances. I pulled out a tailored razor-sharp charcoal business suit and a crisp white silk blouse. I hung the suit carefully on the motel closet door, running my hand along the lapel. David wanted me to dress appropriately for my surrender. I intended to dress appropriately for their funeral. I walked into the cramped bathroom, splashed freezing water on my face, and stared at my reflection. The red mark on my cheek had faded into a dull yellowish bruise, a permanent reminder of the war I was about to finish. I was no longer a victim. I was the architect of their absolute total ruin. I walked out of the cheap neon-lit motel. I carried nothing but my leather briefcase, which held the encrypted hard drive, and my printed executive summary. I immediately hailed a cab and gave the driver the address for the most intimidating legal fortress. Mitchell Bradley was a ghost story whispered among corporate executives and high society socialites. He was a notoriously ruthless attorney, specializing in white-collar crime and high-stakes family law. He destroyed billionaires for sport. I walked into his glass-walled lobby on the 40th floor. The icy receptionist informed me that Mr. Bradley did not take walk-in appointments and was fully booked for 6 months. I did not raise my voice or plead with her. I pulled a single sheet of paper from my briefcase. It contained a highly classified sequence of routing numbers associated with an offshore Cayman Islands trust currently under federal scrutiny. I handed the paper to her and instructed her to deliver it. I told her he would either see me immediately or I would walk down the street to the United States Attorney Office and hand them a $14 million fraud case. She looked at the paper, then at my bruised face, and picked up her phone. Less than a minute later, a set of heavy frosted glass doors opened. Mitchell Bradley stood in the doorway of his massive corner office. He was a truly formidable presence, impeccably dressed with a sharp, calculating gaze that missed absolutely nothing. He waved me inside without a word. His office was a testament to his lethal success, featuring dark mahogany furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire city skyline. He sat behind his desk, steepling his fingers, and looked at me with open skepticism. He bluntly told me that he did not handle standard domestic disputes, messy child custody battles, or simple cheating husbands. He stated that his minimum retainer was $250,000 and asked why a visibly battered woman had just bypassed his security using offshore banking codes. He assumed I was just another desperate wife trying to squeeze a few extra $1,000s out of a wealthy spouse. I sat down in the leather chair across from him, keeping my posture perfectly straight. I did not flinch under his intimidating stare. I told him I was not seeking a divorce settlement. I told him I was seeking a complete corporate and personal annihilation. I introduced myself as Claire, a senior forensic accountant, and stated that my husband and mother-in-law had just attempted to murder my 5-year-old daughter. I explained they weaponized their wealth to secure a corrupt Child Protective Services order and expected me to sign away my parental rights tomorrow in Charles Montgomery's office. Mitchell scoffed slightly at the mention of Montgomery, calling him a glorified paper pusher for the country club elite. Mitchell then stated that wild accusations of attempted murder without hard proof would get me destroyed in a courtroom. I reached into my briefcase and placed the encrypted military-grade hard drive directly onto the center of his immaculate desk. I told him that I did not operate on wild accusations. I operated entirely on irrefutable evidence. I explained that the drive contained 4K resolution security footage with clear audio of Beatrice intentionally crushing adult sedatives into my daughter's drink. I watched his expression shift from dismissive boredom to sudden sharp focus. But I was not finished. I reached into my briefcase a second time and pulled out the thick printed executive summary of the 300-page financial dossier. I dropped the stack of heavily annotated spreadsheets and federal banking records next to the hard drive. I informed him that my husband's family real estate firm, Vanguard Heritage Development, was currently operating as a massive Ponzi scheme. I detailed the fake vendors, the ghost invoices, and the exact digital trail of $14 million stolen directly from private investors and funneled into Beatrice's Cayman Islands trust. I told him I had the digital signatures, the offshore routing numbers, and the exact timestamps of every single fraudulent transfer. I pushed the documents right toward him. I told him that tomorrow morning Charles Montgomery planned to extort me into giving up my daughter. I wanted him to walk into that boardroom with me and turn their extortion attempt into a federal trap. Mitchell Bradley did not say a word for several long moments. He slowly picked up the executive summary, his eyes tracking rapidly across the complex financial flowcharts and offshore account ledgers. He flipped through the pages, his breathing steady, entirely absorbed by the sheer magnitude of the criminality I had meticulously laid out before him. As a man who made his fortune destroying corrupt dynasties, he recognized absolute perfection when he saw it. The air in the room grew heavy with anticipation. He looked at the hard drive containing the poisoning video, then back at the tax fraud dossier. Mitchell Bradley closed the folder and looked up at me. The dismissive skepticism had completely vanished from his eyes. In its place was a brilliant, terrifying gleam of absolute triumph. He smiled a slow, predatory smile that revealed exactly why he was the most feared attorney in the city. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk, and told me that Charles Montgomery was about to experience the worst day of his professional career. Mitchell pressed an intercom button on his desk and ordered his paralegal to cancel his entire schedule for the next 48 hours. He looked back at me, his predatory smile widening into a grin. He declared that we were going to completely rewrite the rules of engagement. We spent the next 3 hours mapping out the ultimate legal ambush, designing a sequence of devastating reveals that would not only secure my absolute custody of Lily, but completely permanently destroy David and Beatrice's lives. I knew that when we walked into that room tomorrow, they would expect a completely broken woman. Instead, they were going to face an absolute nightmare. The trap was set, the evidence was secured, and the timer counting down to their destruction had started. My phone rang at 6 o'clock. It was Dr. Harrison calling from the Pediatric Intensive Care Unit. He informed me that Lily had successfully pulled through the worst of the toxic shock. Her fever broke, her vitals stabilized, and the ventilator was removed. She was breathing independently. I let out a shuddering breath, feeling the heaviest weight lift from my chest. However, the bureaucratic reality of the situation immediately crashed down on us. Because the police investigation into the massive overdose of adult sedatives remained active, and because my husband and mother-in-law had formally accused me of causing the harm, the hospital could not legally release my 5-year-old daughter into my custody. Dr. Harrison explained Lily was being discharged into temporary Child Protective Services emergency foster placement until the police investigation was fully resolved. I had a brief, strictly monitored visit. I stood beside her hospital bed, brushing her hair back, and whispered a promise that Mommy would bring her home by dinner time. Handing my fragile, recovering child over to a state social worker was an agonizing process that tested every ounce of my self-control. It was the ultimate indignity forced upon me by a corrupt family, but it only solidified the absolute ice running through my veins. I wiped my face completely clean of emotion, stepped out of the hospital doors into the freezing winter morning, and hailed a black car to the financial district. The downtown legal offices of Charles Montgomery occupied the top floor of a gleaming glass skyscraper in the wealthiest sector of the city. The space was designed to intimidate opposing counsel and overwhelm desperate spouses. The lobby featured imported Italian marble and a massive receptionist desk. I walked through the double doors, wearing my razor-sharp charcoal business suit, my posture perfectly straight. Mitchell Bradley walked beside me, radiating quiet, lethal energy that completely unnerved the receptionist. We were directed down a long hallway, adorned with modern art, and ushered into the main conference room. The mahogany boardroom was massive and oppressive, featuring a long, polished table that dominated the space. The trap David and Beatrice had demanded was fully assembled exactly to their arrogant specifications. At the far end of the table sat a certified court reporter, her hands poised over a stenography machine, ready to record my absolute surrender. Next to her sat the same stern-faced Child Protective Services representative from the hospital, holding a thick file containing the emergency protective orders. A tall, uniformed police officer stood near the heavy wooden doorway, brought in to serve as the official witness to the custody transfer and to intimidate me into rapid compliance. On the opposing side of the mahogany table sat my soon-to-be ex-husband and his mother, flanked by their high-priced attorney. David wore a custom navy suit, leaning back in his leather executive chair with supreme, unbothered arrogance. He looked at me as if I were dirt on his expensive shoes, convinced his extortion plot had worked perfectly. He believed my presence today was undeniable proof that his malicious threat of a fabricated criminal trial had completely broken my spirit and forced me into submission. Sitting right next to him was Beatrice, looking immaculate in a custom-tailored pearl-colored designer dress and diamond jewelry. She perfectly arranged her features into a mask of exhausted, long-suffering sorrow, playing the role of the devoted grandmother, doing what was necessary to protect her bloodline from an unstable woman. Charles Montgomery sat at the head of the table, organizing thick legal documents with a bored, condescending smirk. He barely glanced up when Mitchell and I entered, assuming Mitchell was just some incompetent, low-tier public defender I had scrambled to hire at the last minute. Mitchell pulled out a leather chair for me, and I sat down directly across from David. The cold air in the massive boardroom was incredibly tense, heavily weighed down with silent, dangerous power dynamics. Montgomery cleared his throat and adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses. He began the meeting by stating for the official record that we were gathered to execute a voluntary, irrevocable surrender of parental rights and a comprehensive dissolution of marital assets. He spoke slowly, using complicated legal jargon designed to confuse and intimidate, reminding the room that this agreement was made in exchange for his clients, advising authorities against pursuing felony child endangerment charges. It was a blatant, unapologetic shakedown, happening right in front of a police officer and a state social worker masked beneath expensive legal phrasing. Their absolute audacity was breathtaking to witness in person. They truly believed their wealth provided them with a bulletproof shield against any form of justice. The silence stretched out, completely dominated by the scratching sounds of the court reporter documenting the extortion. I absorbed the hostile atmosphere, letting the intense pressure settle over me. I kept my hands folded neatly on the polished mahogany table, maintaining a perfectly blank expression. I looked at the thick stack of surrender documents waiting for my signature. I looked at the court reporter who was capturing every single word. I looked at the police officer guarding the door. Everything was perfectly positioned for the absolute greatest corporate and domestic ambush in the entire history of this city. Beatrice leaned forward across the wide mahogany table. She dropped the mask of the grieving grandmother for a fraction of a second, unable to resist the overwhelming urge to gloat over her perceived victory. Her eyes gleamed with toxic, venomous satisfaction. She reached out and lightly patted the pristine surface of the printed surrender documents with her perfectly manicured hand. Beatrice offered me a fake, highly sympathetic smile, leaning in close so only I could hear the pure malice in her voice. She looked right into my eyes, her expression shifting into something genuinely sinister, and whispered softly, "You brought this on yourself, dear. You were never fit for our high society world." Beatrice leaned back into her plush leather chair, her toxic whisper hanging in the freezing air between us. She adjusted her diamond bracelet, utterly satisfied with her cruel delivery. Charles Montgomery, taking his cue from the matriarch, cleared his throat loudly to draw the attention of the entire room back to him. He reached out with long, manicured fingers and gripped the incredibly thick stack of custody surrender papers. With a theatrical sweeping motion, he slid the heavy documents across the polished mahogany table. The papers came to a stop directly in front of me, the stark white pages glaring under the bright recessed lighting of the boardroom. Montgomery folded his hands together and looked down his nose at me. He adopted a tone of extreme nauseating condescension, speaking as if he were addressing an unruly, mentally deficient child who had finally been disciplined. He explicitly told me that I should be expressing profound gratitude for the remarkable mercy his clients were demonstrating today. He stated that a woman in my precarious legal and psychological position would normally be facing immediate incarceration. He reminded the room, making sure the court reporter captured every syllable, that David and Beatrice were choosing grace over vengeance. They were allowing me to quietly forfeit my maternal rights and walk away without a felony conviction, destroying the rest of my miserable life. Montgomery tapped a gold pen against the top page of the agreement, indicating where I needed to initial. He stressed that they had gone out of their way to make this transition seamless for Lily, sparing her the trauma of seeing her mother led away in handcuffs. The sheer hypocrisy of his speech was staggering. He was weaponizing the trauma of a 5-year-old child to secure a corrupt victory for a billionaire family. I looked over at the Child Protective Services representative. She sat with her hands folded over her own file, her expression stoic, fully believing the fabricated narrative that I was an unstable danger to my own daughter. The uniformed police officer near the heavy wooden door shifted his weight, his presence a silent, heavy threat of state, enforced consequences if I dared to resist. I absorbed the overwhelming hostility radiating from every corner of the massive boardroom. I did not break eye contact with Montgomery. I let his condescending lecture wash over me, analyzing the structure of their extortion exactly the way I would analyze a fraudulent corporate ledger. They had built a massive, intimidating facade out of thin air, banking entirely on fear and intimidation to force a rapid compliance. They wanted to rush the signature before anyone could properly examine the foundation of their lies. David suddenly leaned forward, unable to let his lawyer monopolize the moment of triumph. His custom navy suit wrinkled slightly as he planted his elbows on the table. He looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust mixed with overwhelming arrogance. He demanded to know what I was waiting for. He told me to stop dragging this out and wasting the valuable time of everyone in the room. He reminded me that he had highly important corporate meetings to attend and that I was currently delaying his schedule. David sneered, telling me that the game was over, that I had lost completely, and that I needed to accept my defeat like a rational adult. He pointed his finger aggressively at the signature line on the last page of the dense legal document and commanded me to pick up the pen. His voice was sharp, entitled, and completely devoid of any empathy for the woman who had spent 7 years supporting his career. He wanted his victory finalized, and he wanted it immediately so he could return to his pristine, privileged reality without dealing with the messy consequences of his family's actions. I looked down at the documents resting on the polished wood. I slowly reached out my right hand. My fingers brushed the cool metal of the heavy, expensive fountain pen Montgomery had provided. I picked it up. The room went completely dead silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the building's central heating system and the rapid, rhythmic clicking of the court reporter's stenography machine. I moved the pen toward the thick stack of paper. I flipped past the asset forfeiture clauses, past the non-disclosure agreements to the very last page. This was the page containing the final binding signature line that would permanently sever me from my child and my entire financial future. I hovered the metal tip of the pen just millimeters above the dotted line. I held it there perfectly still, my hand absolutely steady. I could feel the intense burning anticipation radiating from the opposite side of the table. David let out a short, harsh breath, an arrogant smirk spreading wide across his face. He leaned back in his leather executive chair again, crossing his arms over his chest, visibly reveling in the absolute power he believed he held over me. He scoffed loudly, telling me to hurry up and sign so they could go back to their real lives, and I could go back to whatever pathetic existence awaited me. I kept the pen hovering over the paper for exactly 3 more seconds. I let them taste the absolute certainty of their victory. I let them savor the powerful illusion that their vast wealth and their high society influence had completely crushed a forensic accountant. Then I slowly lifted the pen away from the paper. I did not rush my movements. I deliberately placed the expensive fountain pen down onto the mahogany table. The metal casing made a sharp, definitive click that echoed loudly in the quiet boardroom. The arrogant smirk on David's face faltered for a fraction of a second. Beatrice stiffened her posture, becoming rigidly upright as her eyes darted to the discarded pen. Charles Montgomery frowned deeply, opening his mouth to issue another aggressive legal threat. I ignored the lawyer entirely. I shifted my gaze away from the stack of surrender documents and locked my eyes directly onto David. I looked at the man who had slapped me in the kitchen, the man who had threatened to bankrupt me, the man who was actively shielding the woman who poisoned our innocent daughter. My voice was calm, steady, and completely devoid of any fear. I looked directly into David's eyes and told him that I think we need to review a piece of medical evidence before I sign anything. Charles Montgomery let out an exasperated sigh, slamming his hand flat against the mahogany table. He aggressively stated that this deposition was not a fishing expedition, and that any medical evidence regarding the child had already been manipulated to serve a false narrative. David leaned forward, his face flushed with sudden anger, demanding that I stop playing games and sign the damn papers immediately. He looked to the police officer near the door, expecting him to intervene and force my compliance. Instead, the officer remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed firmly on Mitchell Bradley. Mitchell stood up slowly, smoothing the front of his tailored suit jacket with absolute calm. He did not ask for permission to speak. He simply took control of the room through the sheer, terrifying weight of his professional presence. He reached into his leather briefcase and extracted a sleek black tablet along with a high-speed connector cable. Without a single word to Montgomery or David, Mitchell walked directly to the head of the conference table and plugged the cable into the main presentation port. The massive 80-inch flat-screen monitor mounted on the far wall hummed to life, casting a stark bright glow across the dark wood of the boardroom. Montgomery immediately stood up, loudly objecting to the unapproved presentation of digital media. He warned that any unauthorized recordings would be stricken from the record and could result in severe legal sanctions against my counsel. Mitchell ignored him completely. He tapped the screen of his tablet and looked directly at the Child Protective Services representative. Mitchell formally stated for the official record that the digital file he was about to play was not an unauthorized recording. It was a direct, unedited export from the Vanguard Heritage Estate's own primary security matrix. He then turned his piercing gaze toward David and delivered a statement that completely froze the oxygen in the room. Mitchell informed them that a duplicate, fully authenticated copy of this exact video file had been personally hand-delivered to the district attorney and the chief of police at 8 o'clock this morning. David froze, the arrogant sneer completely vanishing from his face as his eyes darted from Mitchell to the massive screen. Beatrice gripped the armrests of her leather chair so tightly her knuckles turned bone white. The monitor flickered, and suddenly the pristine, sprawling kitchen of the estate appeared in stunning, flawless 4K resolution. The hidden backdoor access Andre had installed was not just a basic cloud backup. It was a high-definition, military-grade surveillance feed. The viewing angle captured the entire marble island, the commercial refrigerators, and the hallway leading to the grand staircase. The timestamp in the bottom corner of the video indicated the exact date and time of the dinner party, specifically 20 minutes before I had arrived with Lily. The high-fidelity audio kicked in, broadcasting the ambient sounds of the mansion into the silent boardroom. We could hear the faint chatter of the millionaire investors in the distant dining room. Then Beatrice stepped into the frame. She looked exactly as she had that night, wearing her pearl-colored designer dress, her hair perfectly styled. The boardroom watched in absolute horrified fascination as the digital version of Beatrice walked over to the marble island. She reached into her expensive handbag and pulled out a small plastic blister pack. The camera angle was so incredibly sharp that the label on the medication was partially visible. They were maximum strength adult sleep aids. The room watched as Beatrice forcefully pushed 3 pills out of the foil backing. She grabbed a heavy stainless steel culinary muddler from the utensil rack. With a cold, practiced efficiency, she crushed the 3 pills into a fine white powder directly on the marble countertop. The scraping sound of the metal crushing the pills echoed loudly through the boardroom speakers. Next, Beatrice poured a glass of dark red, sugary fruit punch. She used a butter knife to sweep the concentrated chemical powder into the glass, stirring it rapidly until the white residue completely dissolved into the opaque liquid. She wiped the counter clean, leaving absolutely no trace of her actions. The timestamp on the video skipped forward to the moment I walked through the kitchen doors, holding my feverish, exhausted daughter. The visual representation of my past trauma played out before my eyes, but I felt no fear. I watched myself carry Lily toward the staircase. I watched Beatrice intercept us on the landing. Because the estate's security system was equipped with advanced directional microphones, the audio captured the confrontation with terrifying clarity. The boardroom echoed with the sound of my mother-in-law's voice. The digital, Beatrice thrust the heavy crystal goblet into Lily's small, trembling hands. Then the words that would ultimately send her to a federal penitentiary rang out loud and clear. "Drink this, you little brat. Go to sleep so you do not bother my guests." The video showed my innocent, trusting 5-year-old daughter raising the glass to her lips and swallowing the toxic-laced liquid. It showed Beatrice watching her drink it, a look of profound annoyance mixed with chilling satisfaction plastered across her face. She had knowingly, intentionally, and maliciously administered a lethal dose of adult sedatives to a minor solely to preserve the quiet elegance of her networking event. The video proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that she possessed full awareness of her actions and a complete disregard for human life. Mitchell tapped the tablet screen, freezing the video on a high-resolution close-up of Beatrice's face, just as she turned away from Lily. He disconnected the cable, and the massive monitor abruptly went black, casting the room back into its heavy natural lighting. The resulting silence in the mahogany boardroom was absolute and suffocating. The rhythmic clicking of the court reporter's stenography machine had completely stopped. She sat with her hands frozen over the keys, her eyes wide with shock, staring directly at Beatrice. The Child Protective Services representative had dropped her pen. She looked physically sick, her face entirely drained of color, as she processed the irrefutable evidence of premeditated child endangerment. The uniformed police officer at the door instinctively shifted his stance, moving his hand away from his radio and resting it directly on his utility belt, his posture shifting from a passive witness to an active law enforcement presence ready to make an arrest. Charles Montgomery looked like he had just been struck by a speeding vehicle. His expensive gold pen slipped from his fingers and clattered loudly onto the table. He physically pushed his leather chair away from Beatrice, creating as much distance as possible between himself and his client. He knew instantly that defending this case was no longer a matter of expensive legal maneuvering. It was a lost cause, a career-ending association with a violent felony. I kept my eyes locked on Beatrice. The haughty, untouchable matriarch of the Vanguard Heritage Empire had completely shattered. The arrogant, toxic smile she had worn just moments ago instantly vanished. The elegant posture collapsed. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for an ally, searching for an escape route, but finding absolutely nothing except the cold, unyielding reality of her own destruction. She looked at the police officer, then at the frozen image of her own face reflecting on the dark monitor screen. Her flawless aristocratic facade dissolved entirely, replaced by the raw animalistic look of sheer terror. The absolute silence in the mahogany boardroom finally shattered, replaced by a sudden violent eruption of chaos. Charles Montgomery scrambled backward, his heavy leather chair groaning loudly against the hardwood floor. He physically distanced himself from Beatrice as if she were carrying a highly contagious lethal disease. As a seasoned defense attorney who dealt exclusively with wealthy clients, he recognized the devastating difference between a manageable domestic dispute and a premeditated, undeniable felony caught on high-definition camera. He held his hands up in a frantic defensive posture, shaking his head rapidly. He silently communicated to the entire room, and most importantly to the police officer, that he had absolutely no prior knowledge of this horrific act. The Child Protective Services representative let out a sharp, audible gasp that pierced the tense air. She slammed both hands over her mouth, her eyes darting in sheer horror from the blank monitor directly to the woman sitting across the table. The official file containing the emergency protective orders against me slipped entirely off her lap. The useless fabricated documents spilled across the floor in a messy pile. She realized in that exact moment that she had been brutally manipulated and weaponized by a billionaire family. The sudden, terrifying realization of her own complicity in almost handing an innocent child back to an attempted murderer left her visibly trembling in her seat, completely paralyzed by the overwhelming weight of her near-catastrophic professional failure. Beatrice desperately tried to reconstruct her shattered reality. Her mouth opened and closed repeatedly before she finally managed to force a ragged, breathless sound past her throat. She began stammering, her voice high-pitched, frantic, and completely lacking its usual aristocratic polish. She pointed a trembling manicured finger at the dark monitor and shrieked that the video was a complete fabrication. She wildly claimed that I had hired some underground digital expert to manufacture a highly sophisticated deepfake, insisting that the footage was maliciously manipulated to frame her. Beatrice turned to her retreating lawyer, grabbing the sleeve of his expensive tailored suit, and demanded that he officially object to the submitted evidence. She yelled that anyone with a computer could create a fake video nowadays, and that a woman of her impeccable social standing would never commit such an atrocious, barbaric act against her own grandchild. Her desperate, shrill voice echoed off the wood-paneled walls, but her frantic denials only made her look infinitely more guilty. Every single person in that room had just watched her execute a calculated, cold-blooded poisoning. No amount of screaming about digital manipulation was going to erase the horrific truth that was permanently burned into their minds. She was a monster, and the meticulously crafted illusion of her perfect society life was rapidly disintegrating before her very eyes, leaving nothing but an exposed, cornered criminal desperately grasping at impossible lies. David sat completely paralyzed for a few crucial seconds, his mind violently struggling to process the catastrophic collapse of his perfect, privileged world. He looked at his mother, then at me, and finally at the black tablet resting on the polished mahogany table. Instead of experiencing the profound, gut-wrenching horror any normal father would feel upon watching his mother intentionally poison his child, David's narcissistic preservation instincts kicked into absolute overdrive. He did not care about Lily's suffering. He did not care that his daughter had been pushed to the brink of death. He only cared about the sudden terrifying threat to his vast wealth, his unearned reputation, and his personal freedom. His face flushed a dark, angry crimson, the veins in his neck bulging against his crisp white collar. He slammed his fists onto the table with explosive force and pushed himself out of his executive chair. He yelled that I was a completely insane, vindictive woman who would stop at nothing to destroy his flawless family legacy. He screamed that I was a bitter outsider trying to steal his money and ruin his upcoming promotion to chief executive officer. Driven by sheer blinding panic and an overwhelming loss of control, David violently lunged across the wide conference table. He stretched his arms out aggressively, his manicured hands grasping desperately for Mitchell's tablet. He wanted to smash the electronic device to physically destroy the fragile screen, acting on the irrational primal belief that breaking the hardware would somehow magically erase the damning federal evidence already sitting safely in police custody. Before David's fingers could even brush the edge of the tablet, the dynamic in the boardroom shifted with lethal, uncompromising precision. The uniformed police officer, standing near the heavy wooden doors, immediately stepped forward, his heavy boots thudding loudly against the floor. He dropped his right hand squarely onto his radio, his posture instantly transforming into a rigid, commanding stance of active law enforcement. He unclipped the safety strap on his utility belt in one fluid, practiced motion, preparing to physically subdue an escalating dangerous threat in a volatile room. Mitchell Bradley did not even flinch. He did not pull the tablet away or step back from the lunging, furious man throwing himself across the table. Instead, Mitchell leaned forward slightly, planting his hands firmly on the mahogany surface, and met David's wild, panicked eyes with a gaze of absolute freezing calm. Mitchell's voice sliced through the screaming and the chaotic noise like a perfectly sharpened steel blade. He advised David to think very carefully about his next physical movement. Mitchell calmly informed the entire room that lunging for that device would be a catastrophic, life-altering mistake. He stated clearly that attempting to tamper with, destroy, or conceal electronic evidence during an active criminal investigation would only add multiple felony obstruction of justice charges to the massive legal indictment already heading their way. David froze mid-lunge, his outstretched hands trembling violently just inches from the screen. He suddenly realized he was utterly powerless, completely trapped within the inescapable legal cage we had meticulously constructed around his corrupt family. David slowly retracted his trembling hands, the terrifying reality of his situation completely shattering his aggressive posture. He collapsed back into his leather executive chair, his breathing ragged and shallow. The room remained perfectly still as the implications of Mitchell's warning settled over him. Then, like a cornered animal, desperate to chew off its own limb to escape a trap, David instantly turned on the woman sitting next to him. He looked at Beatrice with an expression of manufactured absolute horror. He began shaking his head violently, holding his hands up in a placating gesture toward the police officer and the Child Protective Services representative, who was watching him with absolute disgust. He swore that he had absolutely no idea his mother was capable of such a monstrous act. He practically yelled that he was completely innocent, claiming he was just a busy executive focused on providing a luxurious life for his family. He frantically tried to distance himself from the toxic matriarch he had spent his entire life hiding behind. David looked at me, his eyes wide with a pathetic, desperate pleading that made my stomach turn. He begged me to believe him. He swore he loved Lily more than anything, and promised he would never have stopped me from taking her to the hospital if he had known the truth about the punch. He reached his hand out across the wide mahogany table, his voice dropping into a sickeningly sweet, manipulative whisper. He pleaded with me to let him keep his parental rights, promising we could send Beatrice to prison and raise our daughter together with all the vast resources his family possessed. I stared at him, feeling absolutely nothing but profound, freezing disgust. I did not raise my voice, but my words cut through his pathetic lies with surgical precision. I reminded him that he was the one who slapped me across the face when I tried to carry our convulsing child out the back door. I reminded him that he chased me into the freezing snow, screaming that I was ruining a networking event over a simple fever. I stated clearly that he was entirely complicit the second he chose his corporate reputation over his daughter's life. David realized his emotional manipulation was failing completely. His face hardened again, reverting to the familiar, arrogant bully I had endured for 7 years. He sneered aggressively, adjusting his expensive silk tie. He arrogantly declared that I still needed him. He reminded me that he controlled the primary family trust, the massive bank accounts, and the entire real estate portfolio. He stated that without his generous financial support, I would be a destitute mother struggling to pay medical bills. He offered me a final desperate bribe. He promised to write me a certified cashier's check for $5 million right now, provided I signed a non-disclosure agreement and left him entirely out of the police investigation. He actually believed his wealth was an impenetrable shield that could buy his way out of any consequence. I leaned back in my chair, maintaining unbroken eye contact with the man who had severely underestimated me from the very beginning. I let a slow, icy smile spread across my face. I looked directly into his panicked eyes and delivered the ultimate blow. "You told me I would walk away with nothing, David." I kept my voice perfectly level, letting the words hang in the tense air. "Actually, David, you are the one with absolutely nothing." I reached down into my heavy leather briefcase resting on the floor beside me. I grabbed the thick, securely bound stack of printed spreadsheets, bank records, and federal tax documents. I hoisted the massive 300-page financial dossier into the air and threw it down onto the center of the polished mahogany table with brutal force. The heavy thud echoed like a gunshot through the silent boardroom. Charles Montgomery physically jumped in his seat. Beatrice stared at the intimidating stack of paper, her jaw trembling uncontrollably. David looked down at the title page of the dossier, and the remaining color completely drained from his face. I did not give him a single second to process the nightmare. I systematically dismantled his entire illusion of wealth. I announced to the room that Vanguard Heritage Development was not a prestigious real estate firm. I declared it was a massive collapsing Ponzi scheme. I detailed exactly how they had fabricated vendor invoices, created ghost consulting firms in Nevada, and routinely siphoned capital from their private investors to cover their disastrous downtown projects. I explicitly named the hidden offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands. I recited the exact routing numbers of the hidden accounts holding the $14 million they had aggressively embezzled over the past 3 years. I explained how David had personally authorized fraudulent wire transfers to cover his staggering gambling debts, while Beatrice used the stolen investor funds to finance her private jets and aristocratic country club lifestyle. David began to hyperventilate, his chest heaving as he frantically reached for his cell phone. He tried to open his personal banking application, his fingers slipping across the glass screen in pure terror. I watched him struggle, feeling an overwhelming, satisfying rush of absolute power. I casually checked the sleek silver watch on my wrist, shaking my head. I told him not to bother calling his private wealth manager or any of his corrupt offshore contacts. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table, and delivered the final, devastating climax to my trap. I revealed that I had not just compiled this evidence for my divorce proceedings. I informed David and Beatrice that I had submitted the entire unredacted dossier, complete with their digital signatures, directly to the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation at exactly 8 o'clock this morning. I watched their entire world completely shatter as I told them their accounts were already frozen and the federal agents were already moving in. David's fingers swiped frantically across his smartphone screen, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps as he tried to access his secure offshore banking applications. The error messages flashed back at him, bright red and completely unforgiving, signaling the catastrophic end of his privileged existence. I did not give him a single moment to breathe. I systematically dismantled the $14 million embezzlement scheme right in front of him, letting my voice ring out with absolute, undeniable authority. I told the room exactly how Vanguard Heritage Development had operated as a criminal enterprise under his direct supervision for many years. I detailed the fake consulting invoices from the Nevada shell companies, reciting the exact transaction dates and the precise dollar amounts he had authorized to cover up the massive financial losses from his failed downtown high-rise project. I watched the last remaining drops of blood completely drain from my husband's face as he realized I possessed a photographic memory of every single fraudulent ledger he had ever signed. Beatrice sat frozen in her plush leather chair, her pristine aristocratic mask fully shattered. I turned my unwavering gaze to her, exposing the horrific reality of her lavish lifestyle to everyone. I explained how the stolen investor capital was meticulously routed through international wire transfers straight into her highly classified Cayman Islands trust. I listed the exact cost of her private jet charters, her exclusive country club memberships, and the custom designer wardrobe she wore like a protective suit of armor. I made sure the court reporter captured every single word, permanently etching their financial crimes into the official legal record. I wanted the Child Protective Services representative and the uniformed police officer to clearly understand that the woman who had intentionally poisoned my daughter was not just a domestic abuser. She was a high-level corporate criminal who funded her entire existence by stealing from hard-working, unsuspecting investors. Beatrice opened her mouth to mount a defense, but her voice completely failed her. She looked desperately at Charles Montgomery, her high-priced defense attorney, silently begging him to intervene and stop my relentless verbal assault. Montgomery simply looked away, refusing to make eye contact with a client who was actively going down for massive federal tax evasion. David finally slammed his phone onto the polished mahogany table in a fit of absolute uncontrollable rage. He aggressively tugged at his custom tie. He shouted that my documents were entirely fabricated frantically, claiming that I had hacked into his secure servers and planted false evidence just to frame him. He wildly accused me of being a bitter, resentful accountant who lacked the basic intelligence to understand complex commercial real estate financing. He insisted his bankers would clear this up immediately, aggressively, tapping the screen of his phone to dial his private wealth manager. He believed that if he could just get his elite financial team on the line, he could somehow transfer the remaining capital and flee the jurisdiction before federal authorities mobilized. I watched his pathetic, desperate display of arrogant entitlement with a profound sense of emotional detachment. I slowly lifted my left arm and casually checked the face of my watch, noting the precise placement of the second hand. I looked directly into his panicked, bloodshot eyes. I told him not to bother making that pointless phone call. I kept my voice incredibly calm, delivering the absolute final blow with surgical precision. I stated that his personal accounts, the corporate funds for Vanguard Heritage Development, and his mother's highly secretive offshore trust were officially frozen by federal authorities exactly 20 minutes ago. The stark reality of my statement crashed down upon David with the sheer force of a collapsing building. His hand hovered uselessly over his phone, trembling uncontrollably as the absolute certainty of his total ruin finally registered in his mind. He was completely broke. He had no access to his vast fortune, no ability to hire an army of ruthless defense lawyers, and absolutely no way to buy his way out of a federal indictment. The $14 million they had stolen was completely locked down by the United States government. The multi-million-dollar estate where they had abused me and poisoned my child was likely already in the process of being seized by federal agents. I watched his shoulders slump forward, his chest heaving as the crushing weight of his impending incarceration settled over him. He looked at me with an expression of profound, unadulterated terror, realizing that the quiet, unassuming wife he had slapped in the kitchen was the sole architect of his absolute destruction. Mitchell Bradley sat silently beside me, a sharp, predatory smile playing across his lips as he watched the corrupt billionaire dynasty completely implode. He had perfectly orchestrated the timing of this entire legal ambush, ensuring that the federal warrants were executed at the exact moment I laid out the evidence in this boardroom. The heavy silence in the room was suddenly shattered by the sound of loud, authoritative footsteps marching down the marble corridor outside. The noise grew rapidly louder, purposeful, and entirely unyielding, cutting through the thick tension of the conference room. Charles Montgomery immediately stood up, stepping far away from the mahogany table and raising his hands to clearly signal his total detachment to whoever was approaching. David whipped his head around, his eyes locking onto the entrance in sheer panic. Beatrice let out a short, terrified gasp, gripping the edge of the table as if trying to anchor herself to a reality that no longer existed. The massive, heavy wooden doors of the boardroom were suddenly thrust open with tremendous force. The heavy panels slammed against the interior walls, signaling the end. Two federal agents wearing dark suits and gold badges strode purposefully into the room. Right behind them were two seasoned local detectives from the Major Crimes Division, their expressions grim and strictly professional. The crushing weight of absolute federal justice had arrived directly at their doorstep. The lead detective from the Major Crimes Division walked straight past the polished mahogany table, his eyes locked entirely on Beatrice. He stated his name and department in a commanding voice that left no room for negotiation. He instructed Beatrice to stand up immediately and place her hands behind her back. Beatrice stared at him, her aristocratic mask crumbling into sheer horror. She haughtily demanded to know exactly what was happening, asserting there had been a terrible mistake and reminding the officers she was a prominent member of high society. The detective was unmoved by her wealthy indignation. He pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his utility belt and formally announced that she was being arrested for felony child endangerment, aggravated assault, and the deliberate poisoning of a minor. He grabbed her arm firmly, forcing her out of her plush leather chair. Beatrice began to shriek, a frantic sound of pure desperation that shattered the quiet of the legal office. The cold metal cuffs clicked shut around her wrists with a sharp, terrifying finality. She violently thrashed against the detective's grip, her expensive designer dress twisting awkwardly as she lost her balance. She screamed frantically for David to do something, demanding that he call the police commissioner, demanding that he use their vast wealth to make this absolute nightmare stop. She wailed hysterically that she could not go to a filthy jail, sobbing that her pristine social standing would be ruined forever. David could not help her. He could barely process the chaotic reality of his mother's arrest before the two federal agents advanced rapidly on him. The lead agent flashed his gold badge, his expression carved from absolute stone. He explicitly informed David that he was being taken into federal custody. The agent recited the charges with chilling precision, listing federal wire fraud, corporate tax evasion, and the organized embezzlement of $14 million from private real estate investors. The devastating words hit David like physical blows, knocking the remaining breath from his lungs and draining the color from his face. As the second agent roughly pulled David's arms behind his back, the lead agent began reciting his Miranda rights, in a steady monotone, informing him that he had the right to remain silent and that anything he said could be used against him in a court of law. David looked wildly around the massive boardroom for any sign of salvation. He locked his desperate eyes with Charles Montgomery, aggressively demanding that his high-priced defense attorney intervene and halt the unlawful arrest. Montgomery simply picked up his heavy leather briefcase and took another deliberate step backward toward the wall. Montgomery coldly stated for the official record that his prestigious firm only handled family law and civil corporate disputes. He explicitly informed David that he was not a criminal defense attorney and that he officially recused himself from representing either of them moving forward. Montgomery abandoned them right then and there, wanting absolutely nothing to do with a sinking ship, carrying massive federal indictments and undeniable video evidence of child poisoning. The heavy steel handcuffs locked tightly around David's wrists, securely fastening his hands behind his back. The absolute reality of his catastrophic situation finally crushed him. The multi-million-dollar offshore bank accounts were completely frozen by government authorities. The vast Vanguard Heritage real estate empire was publicly exposed as a massive fraudulent scheme. The high society lawyers were sprinting for the exits to protect their own careers. David was completely stripped of the unearned financial power and toxic wealth he had constantly used to terrorize me and abuse our innocent daughter. His knees buckled under the overwhelming pressure, and the federal agent had to firmly grip his shoulder just to keep him standing upright. David's arrogant demeanor completely evaporated into thin air, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, pathetic coward facing decades behind bars. He turned his desperate, bloodshot eyes toward me. His voice cracked pathetically as he began to beg. He pleaded with me to stop the agent, sobbing uncontrollably that I was the only person who could fix this catastrophic disaster. David swore frantically that he had been completely blind to his mother's actions, that he had made terrible professional mistakes, but that he genuinely still loved me. He shamelessly begged for my mercy, asking me to tell the federal authorities that the comprehensive financial documents were just a massive accounting misunderstanding. He cried out that he desperately wanted to be a good father to Lily, promising that we could start over, that we could leave his mother behind and build a brand new life together. He weaponized our 7 years of marriage, desperately trying to manipulate my deepest emotions one last time to save himself from a cold, unforgiving prison cell. I remained perfectly still, sitting calmly in my leather chair while the total chaos unfolded all around me. I listened to his pathetic, groveling pleas, analyzing the sheer cowardice radiating from the very same man who had violently slapped me across the face just 48 hours ago. I looked over at Beatrice, who was still weeping hysterically and dragging her feet as the local detective physically hauled her toward the heavy wooden doors. I looked back at David, observing the tears streaming down his flushed face as he desperately begged for the exact mercy he had completely denied me and our vulnerable daughter. I slowly pushed my chair back from the mahogany table and stood up to my full height. I smoothed the front of my tailored charcoal business suit, feeling an overwhelming surge of absolute power and total liberation. I walked slowly around the massive table, stopping just a few feet away from where the stern federal agents firmly held my soon-to-be ex-husband in heavy steel handcuffs. I looked directly into his panicked, weeping eyes. My expression held absolutely zero compassion. I let the freezing, calculating silence stretch between us for one long, agonizing moment. My voice was incredibly calm, perfectly echoing with the exact unforgiving, arrogant tone he and his mother had used against me for so many painful years. I looked at my ex-husband with absolute ice in my eyes and delivered the final lethal blow. A little federal prison will not kill you. Stop embarrassing the family, David. The heavy mahogany doors slammed shut, sealing the fate of the Vanguard Heritage dynasty forever. That deafening sound echoed in my mind for weeks, serving as the definitive conclusion to a lifetime of abuse and manipulation. 6 months have passed since that chaotic morning in Charles Montgomery's legal office. The blinding flash of news cameras and the relentless media frenzy that surrounded their high-profile arrests have finally faded into a quiet, manageable peace. The suffocating winter gave way to a bright, promising spring, and now the crisp autumn breeze signals a completely new chapter. The dust has completely settled over the ruins of my former life. I am no longer fighting for survival. I am simply living. David and Beatrice did not find a miraculous legal loophole. Their immense wealth, previously their absolute shield against consequence, was immediately seized by federal authorities to compensate the defrauded investors. Without their stolen millions, they could not afford the elite crisis management teams or the ruthless defense sharks required to spin their narrative. Faced with the mountain of irrefutable forensic evidence, I provided David completely cracked under federal pressure. He accepted a comprehensive plea deal, pleading guilty to multiple counts of federal wire fraud, tax evasion, and massive corporate embezzlement. He is currently serving a 25-year sentence in a federal penitentiary, permanently stripped of his tailored suits and his arrogant entitlement. Beatrice attempted to fight her charges in open court, clinging to her shattered aristocratic pride until the bitter end. The jury watched the crystal-clear, high-definition security footage of her poisoning her own granddaughter. It took them less than 2 hours to return a guilty verdict. She was convicted of felony child endangerment, aggravated assault, and complicity in massive financial crimes. They are now nothing more than federal inmates. The untouchable matriarch of local high society is now facing the rest of her natural life behind bars. The Vanguard Heritage name is entirely obliterated, completely scrubbed from country club registries and elite charity boards, leaving nothing but a cautionary tale of unchecked greed. The legal bloodbath extended directly into family court. With Mitchell Bradley acting as my unrelenting legal advocate, the custody battle was over before it ever truly began. The family court judge took one look at the attempted murder conviction and David's subsequent federal incarceration and immediately terminated his parental rights. I was granted full sole and absolutely irrevocable legal and physical custody of my daughter. David was permanently legally erased from Lily's future. Furthermore, Mitchell relentlessly pursued the remaining legitimate assets untainted by the Ponzi scheme. The court recognized the severe emotional distress caused by their coordinated extortion. They awarded me the majority of those liquidated properties and a massive restitution sum as direct compensation for the financial abuse I endured during the marriage. I did not take the money out of greed. I took it to guarantee that my daughter would never face a single day of financial insecurity. I was not the only one who escaped the toxic gravity of that family. Andre, the brilliant African-American cybersecurity expert who risked everything to secure the damning kitchen footage, finally received the respect and freedom he deserved. When the Vanguard empire imploded, his wife Penelope faced an ultimate choice between her corrupt bloodline and her husband. She chose Andre. Penelope completely severed all ties with her mother and brother, legally changing her last name and walking away from the toxic aristocratic illusion she had been raised to protect. With the quiet, untraceable financial backing I provided, as a gesture of profound gratitude, Andre launched his own elite independent cybersecurity firm. They relocated to the West Coast, completely cutting ties with the poisoned legacy of the Vanguard name. They are thriving, building a massive corporate clientele based on absolute integrity and living a genuinely happy, peaceful life far away from Beatrice's racist microaggressions and manipulative control. I sit on the wraparound porch of our beautiful sunlit new home, a quiet sanctuary nestled on a peaceful tree-lined street far away from the oppressive estates of the elite. I hold a warm cup of coffee, feeling the gentle morning breeze against my face. I watch Lily running across the green lawn, her bright laughter filling the crisp autumn air. She is completely fully recovered from the toxic shock, a vibrant, energetic 5-year-old girl who loves catching butterflies and building elaborate castles in the sandbox. There are no lingering effects from the poison, no shadows of trauma clouding her bright, innocent eyes. She is safe, she is loved, and she is entirely mine. She is the sole reason I found the courage to fight back against impossible odds. I take a slow, deep breath, reflecting on the brutal, incredible journey that brought us to this exact moment. A year ago, I was an undervalued, emotionally abused wife, constantly shrinking myself to fit into a mold designed by a narcissistic husband and a cruel, calculating mother-in-law. I accepted their subtle insults, tolerated their blatant disrespect, and convinced myself that enduring their toxicity was simply the price of keeping my family together. But the absolute second they laid a hand on my innocent child, the compliant, obedient wife completely died. In her place, a fiercely independent, dangerously capable woman was born. I did not just survive their brutal extortion attempt. I used my unique professional skills to meticulously map out their vulnerabilities, set an inescapable legal trap, and systematically burn their entire corrupt billionaire empire straight to the ground. I destroyed the monsters who threatened my daughter, and from the ashes of that spectacular destruction, I built a beautiful, secure, and fiercely independent new world for us both. The most profound lesson to emerge from Claire's harrowing ordeal is that true security is never gifted by others. It must be forged through unwavering self-reliance and the courage to establish absolute boundaries. For years, Claire endured quiet indignities and toxic manipulation, subscribing to the dangerous illusion that maintaining the facade of a unified family required endless self-sacrifice. She allowed her husband David and her mother-in-law Beatrice to dictate her worth, falsely believing that enduring their aristocratic arrogance was simply the price of preserving her marriage and protecting her daughter. However, when faced with the ultimate betrayal, the deliberate poisoning of her child, and the cold-blooded prioritization of high society status over a human life, the illusion permanently shattered. The story brilliantly illustrates that predators thrive on the assumption of their victim's weakness. David and Beatrice weaponized their immense wealth and societal influence, expecting Claire to simply fold under the terrifying threat of legal ruin and public humiliation. They fundamentally misunderstood that a mother driven by the primal need to protect her child instantly becomes an unstoppable force. Claire's ultimate victory was not achieved through erratic emotional outbursts or hysterical vengeance. Her success stemmed entirely from her ability to harness her unique professional skills, maintain glacial composure under unimaginable pressure, and systematically dismantle a corrupt empire from the inside out. She stopped waiting for a rescue that was never coming and instead became her own savior. This narrative serves as a powerful reminder that our inherent value is never determined by those who actively seek to diminish us, and we hold the absolute power to rewrite our reality. If you have ever had to burn down a toxic environment to protect your peace, share your story in the comments below.